Thank you to all three candidates. So we have one question that has been submitted collectively by the Tibetan organizations in Toronto, and I'll ask the question first, and then Mr. Gerard Kennedy, if you can answer first, and then Mr. Train, and then Ms. Nash. So the destructive practice of mining in Tibet is an issue that is of growing concern for the Tibetan community. With the destruction of Tibet's land, the forced resettlement of Tibetans, and specifically Tibetan nomads, and the pollution of Tibet's water resources, which would not only affect the Tibetan people, but over 1 billion other people downstream in 11 surrounding countries, including India, China, and Nepal. Above this, Tibetans on the ground are not benefiting economically from mining, with jobs going to Han Chinese over Tibetans, bringing in even more Han Chinese into Tibet and diluting Tibet's already sensitive population. There are regularly protests and actions being taken by Tibetans on the ground against mining in Tibet, but which are brutally suppressed by Chinese authorities, even resulting in death in some cases. In 1999, when the Chinese government implemented their politically motivated Western Development Campaign, Canadian-based mining companies like China Gold International Resources and Continental Minerals led the gold rush into Tibet. Because of these reasons, Tibetan organizations and Tibet support groups in Canada were active in trying to get Bill C-300 passed in Parliament, which we saw as a stepping stone to making sure Canadian mining corporations are held accountable for their abusive extraction practices in countries like Tibet. This bill was, however, subsequently defeated in Parliament just in October. For all three candidates, what are your thoughts on the mining issue in Canada? And what, if any, plans do you have to making sure Canadian mining corporations are held accountable for their abusive practices in Tibet and other foreign countries? So, Mr. Gerard Kennedy, you can go first.
Thank you very much. It's a very important question. It's bigger than Tibet, but it affects Tibet almost more than any other country. Perhaps the Congo is where Canada has bigger investments and so on. The basic principle is this: Canadian companies have to behave with the same respect for the environment, for human rights, for labor standards abroad as they do in Canada. Bill C-300 was brought forward as a private member's bill by a Liberal, received tremendous amount of support. Unfortunately, the Conservatives would not let it be treated as a private member's bill. They all voted against it. A handful of people also otherwise disagreed, but I supported the bill at first and second reading. I supported it by speaking in the House. I was paired off with the Conservative when the final vote came, so the votes were neutralized, but I supported that bill all the way through. I spoke to it in caucus, in the public. I've attended events in support of that, and I think it's very important to note that a Liberal government would bring forward a similar bill that would have a similar effect of making Canadian corporations be companies that we can be proud of. So this is a really strong area that we have to continue to focus on and continue to work on. And I'm going to work with Mr. McKay, who brought the bill forward, to make sure there's a replacement bill regardless of the Parliament, but I'm looking forward to doing that as part of a Liberal government. Thank you.
Certainly, we need to hold our mining companies accountable, and we need to hold them to the same test internationally as we do here in Canada. It was actually the NDP under Peter Julian who first introduced this bill. Unfortunately, Mr. Kennedy voted against it at the time, but it was a bill, Bill C-354, which would hold to account companies to human rights, labor, and environmental standards abroad that they are required to meet here in Canada. And, you know, it is important that we not only say we support these things, but that we actually show up to vote for them, and that we're there and that we're in the House of Commons when these crucial votes take place. I know that the Tibetan lobby on Parliament Hill, one of the issues was opposed to the resettling of nomads from the grasslands for mining, and that these communities are not benefiting from the mining, but they have only to lose because they're losing their way of life, they're losing their homes. And I completely support the Tibetan community in preventing this from happening because it destroys a total way of life. And we have to insist that not only in trade do we instill human rights, but in our corporate practices domestically and internationally. We instill human rights and respect for law and respect for our environment. Thank you.
When those massive discoveries of minerals took place not so many years ago in the plateau, the Chinese obviously recognized what a boon this would be to their growing economy. And it is an economy that is growing exponentially. But at the same time, it's an economy that is growing that does not have much respect for the ecology and the peoples around it. Now, as a Canadian, and I concur with both of my worthy opponents, that if we are going to have our companies overseas, that they will be held to the same standards as companies are held here. They must be, because they are not only Canadian companies, they represent Canada abroad. And if we cannot stand up for the values that we have here, when we have organizations there, then where is our dignity? Where are our ethics? We must ensure, and I concur with both of my opponents, that there is some sort of oversight that we have to put in place to ensure that companies that call themselves Canadians act like Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you to all three candidates. So now we're going to open up questions to the floor. Again, if you can ask your questions in Tibetan or English, and if you ask your question in Tibetan, then Kepula will translate. So if anyone has any questions, you can put your hands up. And remember, please keep your questions to under a minute.
My question is, it is justified to compromise human rights, fundamental human rights over the economy? In the Western democracy, usually I see that economy trumps over the human rights, or dollar trumps over the human rights. So what you candidates can do to bring a change in your party positions, like NDP and Liberal and Conservative, to bring about that change? Okay.
Was that for every candidate? That was for every? Okay, so Mr. Finn will go first, then Mrs. Nash, and then...
Okay, thank you. Yes, this is a conundrum that we're constantly faced with because of the realities that we face globally. But one thing that I have to say, it's not an either-or question. We cannot have on one side an economic blockage of how we are going to move forward with the emerging nations, because they have some very, very abhorrent human rights records. But at the same time, we have to recognize that, as His Holiness has always said, that we have moved forward with reason, with dialogue, with openness, understanding, to have those discussions, to make sure that people understand that they are being watched, because evil cannot stand the light. And that is part of the thing that we must do. We must watch them closely, because if we do not watch them, they will do things that, well, as you know, are abhorrent. But as far as the economics of the thing, it's a process. We can't have it one way or the other way. The world is changing, but we have to work with the PRC to get them to understand that their behaviors are unacceptable in many, many areas. And if they are going to continue to engage in the West, that they must change. They must change. Thank you.
Well, you know, today we live in what is commonly called a globalized economy. But what has been globalized is the economic activity, and what we need to do is to globalize our concern for the environment, our support for human rights, and our support for labor standards. I do not believe we can continue to divorce trade from rights. There are those who are afraid, for example, to stand in protest in front of the Chinese consulate or the Chinese embassy. They are afraid. Why? Because they think that it's going to damage trading relationships. I believe that mature countries can have good trading relationships based on good human rights and solid respect for the environment and solid labor rights. this is what we must do. And what a new Democrat government would do is ensure that when we negotiate trade agreements, that human rights is not just something to pay lip service to, that it is an integral part of our trading arrangements, that we must, if we want to trade, we must also have respect for human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. It is a good question, and I think the question is about what would change. None of the parties have positions that are having the impact that we need to have. I think what happened is, in the early days, most of the parties expressed severe concern about human rights, and some would refuse to get into trade arrangements. A more so-called pragmatic view was taken, but the promise always was that at the international level, the Doha round, there would be human rights, there would be labor, there would be environmental rights taken care of. And I see, even though that stalled, it gave everybody an excuse not to do bilateral arrangements and to effectively lower standards so that only economic things have won out. So the question was, how would we change in our parties? We have to start to now insist on this as part of how we move forward. But I won't pretend to you, we can all be mighty and wave our hands anywhere. Chinese embassy, Parliament Hill, in Parliament, we can do that to show, but the real thing that will work when we work with other countries. There are other countries facing the same conundrum, with a charter of rights like Canada's or a similar protection of human rights, and yet companies are abroad doing different things. We need to form a community of concern internationally, and that's what the Liberal Party would try and do. We have something we call international networks, and we want to work with Tibetans, we want to work with Chinese Canadians, many of whom have expressed severe concern about the treatment of people in Tibet, to create those networks of understanding, not just trade, but at the research level, at the university levels, and so on. There have to be some new approaches. Simply repeating what you want to hear does not bring the goal forward. That's not the middle way that His Holiness talks about, as a persistence on a number of levels. And it is time, and that's the core of what I think your question was, to change our approach. So outside of that global trading arrangement, there still are ways for countries to work together, and we can find those countries, and we can put the pressure on, and we can put new standards so that the economy doesn't always win out over human rights as well as environmental and labor necessities. Thank you.